He didn't look up from his phone when he said it. "You're useless, Grandpa. You can't even help me with this." The words were casual, tossed like crumbs to a bird, but they landed heavy in my chest. I stared at the boy I once cradled, his face lit by the blue glow of a screen, and wondered when his eyes had last held any warmth for me. I didn't correct him. I simply asked him to pass the salt. It started so quietly that, for a while, I thought I'd imagined it. Ethan used to drop by every Saturday afternoon, like clockwork. He'd show up with a backpack slung over one shoulder, sometimes bringing me a muffin from the bakery near the bus stop. We'd play chess, talk about whatever was on his mind, and I'd send him home with a jar of honey from my hives or a bag of tomatoes from the garden. But lately, there was always something else for him to do. A sports practice. A study group. A friend's birthday. The calls became shorter, the visits fewer, until weeks would go by without him stepping through my door. The first time I noticed the difference was on a damp, gray Sunday in early March. I'd been expecting him for lunch, roast chicken, his favorite, but at 10 in the morning, my phone buzzed. A brief message: "Can't make it. Busy." No explanation, no suggestion for another day. I remember sitting at the kitchen table after reading that text, my coffee cooling in front of me. The roast was already in the oven. I told myself it was fine, teenagers have their own lives. It wasn't a rejection, just the natural course of things. At least, that's what I tried to believe. When he did visit, his attention seemed elsewhere. One Saturday, he came in without taking off his earbuds, the tinny rhythm of a song spilling faintly from them. I asked how school was going. "Good. How was the science project?" "Fine." Each answer was a pebble dropped into deep water, vanishing without a ripple. His mother, my daughter-in-law, seemed different too. When I phoned, she'd answer with the practiced cheer of someone already halfway out the door. "Hi, Dad, listen, we're just heading out, can I call you back?" That call would never come. Even when I'd ask a specific question, about a doctor's appointment, or whether they'd like me to make my pecan pie for Sunday, her tone carried a certain polite impatience, like she was managing a queue of more important matters. I didn't take it personally at first. People get busy. Lives pull in different directions. But over time, the air between us grew colder, though no one ever said why. One Sunday dinner in early April sealed that feeling in my mind. The whole family was over, my son, my daughter-in-law, Ethan. The table was set with the good plates, the smell of rosemary potatoes drifting through the air. We all sat down, the chatter easy at first, until I realized Ethan's head was bent over his phone. "Ethan," I said, gently, "put that away for now." He didn't look up. "I'm listening." But his thumb kept moving, flicking across the screen. I tried again. "What's so interesting there?" He shrugged. "Just a game." And that was that. The conversation rolled on without him, but I noticed he'd only chime in if someone mentioned something online, a streamer, a meme, an inside joke from his friend group. The family stories, the talk of gardens and weather and neighbors, washed past him like background noise. That night, after everyone had gone, I cleared the plates and noticed his chair still tucked neatly under the table. The cushion bore no dent, as though he'd never quite been present in it. It wasn't anger I felt. More a quiet ache. The same ache I used to feel after coming home from long fishing trips when my own kids were small, that bittersweet mix of love and distance, knowing time had been lost. The difference was, back then, I could always make up for it. This time, I wasn't so sure. In the weeks that followed, little signs made the change undeniable. The chessboard gathered dust on the side table. The jar of honey I'd set aside for him sat unopened. The seat by the garden, where he'd once sat shelling peas with me, stayed empty, the bench damp from spring rain. One evening, while mending a tear in my old fishing jacket, I heard children's laughter outside. I glanced through the window and saw Ethan on the sidewalk, walking with two boys his age. They were laughing about something, heads close together, not a glance toward my gate. I didn't call out to him. I just watched until they turned the corner, swallowed by the gold wash of a street lamp. That's when I understood, whatever was pulling him away from me wasn't a momentary drift. It was a tide, slow but steady, carrying him toward a shore I might never stand on again. Still, I told myself, there was time. He was only 16. Maybe this was just the phase everyone talks about. The moodiness, the growing pains, the search for independence. But deep down, beneath all that rationalizing, I felt something shift. Not a break, not yet, but the first small tear in the cloth between us. The kind that starts invisible, but frays with every tug. I began to notice the silence more than the conversations. It filled the kitchen when I made breakfast for one. It hung in the hallway after a call that ended too soon. It seeped into the spaces where his laughter used to be. And though I didn't know it then, that silence was only the beginning. It was a Thursday. Birthdays have a way of feeling different from the moment you wake up, even before anyone says the words. When I was younger, I'd wake to the rustle of wrapping paper in the kitchen or the smell of bacon from the pan. In later years, it was quieter, a card propped against the coffee pot, a phone call from my son before work. But there was always something. That morning, the light in my bedroom was a soft winter gray, the kind that seems to slow the day before it's begun. I sat up slowly, my knees stiff, and reached for my glasses. The clock read 7:12. No messages yet. I made coffee, the good beans I save for special days. As it brewed, I checked my phone. Nothing. Not from my son, my daughter-in-law, or Ethan. I told myself it was early still. People get caught up in the morning rush. By mid-morning, the house smelled faintly of rain drifting in from the garden. I busied myself in the workshop, sanding the edge of a stool I'd been making. The phone sat on the bench beside me, face up, just in case. I didn't want to miss a call because of the hum of the sander. No call came. Around lunchtime, I walked down to the bakery. The girl behind the counter smiled and asked if I was celebrating anything. Just another year, I said. I bought a small chocolate cake, the kind Ethan liked when he was younger. I thought maybe, if they called, I could invite them over for a slice. Back home, I set the cake on the counter, still in its white box, and made myself a sandwich. I ate it standing up, looking out the kitchen window at the bare branches swaying in the wind. By 3 o'clock, I had stopped checking the phone every few minutes. I told myself maybe they were planning something for the evening, a surprise, even. The thought was thin, but it was something to hold on to. The afternoon faded into that hour where the light turns the walls a pale amber. I poured myself a small glass of sherry and sat in the armchair by the window, watching the clouds shift. Across the street, the neighbors' kids were kicking a ball, their voices bright against the stillness of the street. 5 o'clock. 6. I cut a slice of the cake, just for me. The frosting was thick and sweet, the kind that sticks to the roof of your mouth. I ate it slowly, the way you eat when you have no one to talk to. The rest of the cake sat untouched, the knife resting beside it. By 7, I knew there was no surprise coming. No dinner, no knock on the door, no video call with candles and laughter on the other end. It was just another Thursday in a house that seemed larger than it had in the morning. I carried the cake back to the kitchen, covered it with foil, and placed it in the fridge. Then I opened the drawer beside the sink and took out an old birthday card. Ethan had made it when he was 10, thick construction paper folded unevenly, the front covered in marker stars. Inside, in crooked handwriting, it said, "Best Grandpa in the world. You make everything fun." The edges were worn now, the ink fading. I traced the letters with my finger, feeling the ghost of the boy he used to be. That night, I sat at the table with a single candle burning, not because I needed the light, but because I wanted the company of its small, steady flame. Outside, the rain tapped softly against the window. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock in the hall. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry. Just a kind of hollow, as though something important had been misplaced, not lost forever, but gone from sight. Lying in bed later, I thought about the birthdays I'd given Ethan over the years. The train set when he was 7, the second-hand guitar when he was 14, the fishing trip where he caught nothing but still bragged to his friends about the one that got away. Those memories felt like another lifetime, one where he still looked to me for joy, not out of habit but out of love. Before sleep came, I made a quiet decision. If this was how things were now, then I would learn to stop expecting the old ways to return. Expectations, after all, are only invitations for disappointment. And though I didn't know it then, this birthday was more than just a forgotten date. It was the line, faint but certain, that marked before and after. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring. The garden had been thirsty for days, and the air carried that heavy stillness that comes before rain. I'd just finished staking the tomato plants when I realized I'd left the basket of laundry outside. The shirts and towels hung limp on the line, the fabric still warm from the sun. I was halfway across the yard when I heard voices drifting from the open back door. Ethan's voice. He's useless. Can't even use a computer. Last time I asked him for help, he didn't have a clue. There was laughter, not cruel in tone, but careless, the kind that comes easily when the target isn't in the room. I couldn't hear the reply from the other end of his call, but it made him laugh again. I stopped beside the laundry line, my hand resting on one of my shirts. The cotton was soft, the heat from the sun still clinging to it. For a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the kitchen clock drifting through the doorway. I could have stepped inside. Could have cleared my throat, let him know I was there. Instead, I stayed where I was, the damp scent of soil and leaves in the air, and listened to my grandson speak of me like I was nothing more than a relic cluttering up the corner of his life. He went on, talking about how I just sit around, and how he doesn't get how things work now. His words were spoken between bursts of amusement at whatever his friend was saying back. I didn't feel the heat of anger. What I felt was quieter, heavier. Like watching a photograph fade, the details softening until the faces were no longer clear. The memory of teaching him to ride a bike rose unbidden. The way his small hands had clutched mine as I ran beside him down the path, breathless, telling him to keep pedaling. The way his face had lit up when he realized he was doing it on his own. Back then, I was someone who could guide him, steady him. Someone he trusted. Now, I was useless. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and the faint creak of the laundry line. I unpinned the first shirt, folded it slowly over my arm, and moved down the line, one item at a time. Each piece of fabric held the sun's warmth, a simple, grounding thing. Inside, Ethan's voice lowered as if he'd moved into the living room. I heard the couch cushions sigh under his weight. The conversation drifted beyond earshot, and the house grew quiet again. When I finally stepped inside, the air was cooler. The hallway light was off, the shadows soft against the walls. I placed the laundry basket on the dining table and began folding, the rhythm steady, my hands moving without thought. Ethan came in a few minutes later, phone in his pocket, his face unreadable. "I'm going to head home," he said. I nodded. "All right. See you." He didn't notice the dirt still on my palms, or the faint tremor in the way I smoothed the edge of a towel. He didn't notice much of anything. After he left, I stood in the doorway for a while, listening to the rain begin to tap against the roof. I knew, then, that something had shifted for good. I didn't decide to stop helping him out of spite. It was more like closing a door gently after realizing it no longer led anywhere. If he asked for my help again, I'd give it, but I would no longer offer it freely, no longer put my hand on the bike seat to keep him steady. Some lessons aren't taught through lectures or punishment. Some are taught in the quiet absence of what was once freely given. That night, I sat at my desk, the window cracked open to let in the cool, damp air. I took out an old notebook and began jotting down ideas for the summer, projects in the workshop, books I'd been meaning to read, the small repairs around the house I'd been putting off. Things I could do on my own, without waiting for anyone to join me. The rain kept falling, a steady, soft percussion against the eaves. It didn't wash away the sting of his words, but it gave me something else, the reminder that the world moves on, whether we're ready for it or not. I went to bed with the sound of water in the gutters and the knowledge that, while this wound was quiet, it was also deep. Have you ever heard someone you love belittle you when they thought you couldn't hear? It was 2 weeks after the conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. The morning was bright and sharp, sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor in long gold strips. I'd been oiling the hinges on the back door when I heard the knock, 3 quick raps, the way Ethan always used to do when he wanted me to hurry. He stepped inside without waiting for me to open it fully, backpack slung low, his hair damp from the shower. "Hey, Grandpa," he said, already moving toward the fridge. "Afternoon," I replied, setting the oil can on the counter. "Hungry?" "Nah. Just came to ask something." He closed the fridge without taking anything, then leaned against the counter like he had somewhere else to be. "So, we've got this senior trip coming up. It's, like, a big deal. Everyone's going." I nodded. "Sounds nice." "Yeah, but it's expensive. Like, $500 expensive." He said it flat, as though naming the amount was the same as handing me a bill. I waited for the rest, for a please, or even an explanation of why it mattered so much. None came. "And you're asking if I can help?" I said. "Well, yeah. I mean, you've got money, right?" He was smiling, but there was no warmth in it, just the easy assumption of someone who'd never considered being told no. I set the rag I'd been holding on the counter. "That's a fair bit of money, Ethan." "What's it for, exactly?" He sighed, as if I were dragging the conversation out unnecessarily. "Travel, hotels, activities. I don't know, they gave us a list. But the deadline's next week, so I need it soon." I studied his face, not the boy who used to sit on my knee, but a young man already certain the world owed him whatever he asked for. "That's not a small request," I said. His shoulders lifted in a shrug. "If you were worth anything, you'd just pay it." The words came out without hesitation, like they'd been waiting behind his teeth. I didn't react right away. My hand stayed still on the counter, my eyes on the sunlight warming the floorboards. Inside, something gave way, not loudly, but with the quiet certainty of a rope snapping after years of strain. When I did speak, my voice was steady. "I'll think about it." He looked at me for a moment, frowning, as though trying to decide if that was a yes. "Okay, but remember, deadline's next week." He left soon after, pulling the door shut with more force than necessary. The house felt different once he was gone, the air heavier somehow. I poured myself a glass of water and sat in the armchair by the window, the one that faces the street. The glass left a faint ring on the armrest, but I didn't bother moving it. I thought about the way he'd looked at me, not as a person, but as a resource. Something to tap into when convenient, dismiss when not. I thought about the word useless, the one I'd overheard him use weeks before, and how it sat side by side with this new judgment, worth anything. I stayed in that chair for a long while, watching the shadow of the maple tree shift across the lawn. The sun moved, the day cooled, and still I didn't turn on the lights. It wasn't pride that made my decision. It wasn't spite, either. It was something simpler, a refusal to keep offering pieces of myself to someone who no longer saw them as gifts. By evening, I had settled into a calm I hadn't expected. Not relief, exactly, but a sense that a boundary had finally been drawn, one I should have marked long ago. I made a small dinner, scrambled eggs, toast, a sliced tomato from the garden. I ate at the kitchen table, the sound of the fork against the plate loud in the quiet. The air smelled faintly of the oil I'd used on the hinges earlier, sharp and clean. After washing the dishes, I went to the study and pulled open the desk drawer where I keep a stack of old letters. There, among the folded papers and photographs, was a list I'd made years ago, things I'd wanted to do, someday. Learn to carve a chess set. Restore the rocking chair on the porch. Write down the family recipes before they were lost. It struck me then that someday had arrived, and that I didn't need anyone's permission to begin. That night, I lay in bed listening to the wind shift through the trees. My decision sat quietly in my mind, would not pay for the trip. And when the deadline came and went, I would offer no explanation, no apology. Some endings don't arrive with a fight. Sometimes they settle in as gently as nightfall, changing everything without a sound. After the trip deadline passed without my contribution, Ethan didn't come by. There was no call, no message asking why. Just a stretch of days where his absence was another fixture in the house, like the worn armchair in the corner or the clock whose ticking I had learned to stop hearing. At first, the quiet pressed in on me. The house had its own sounds, small and persistent, the soft groan of the floorboards in the hall, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional rattle of a loose pane when the wind shifted. But none of those filled the space in quite the same way as a voice calling, "Grandpa," from the doorway. I found myself waking earlier than usual, the sky still pale. I'd make coffee and stand at the kitchen window while the kettle hissed, watching the light creep across the garden. The tomatoes were coming in strong that year, the vines heavy enough to bend the stakes. I spent long mornings out there, weeding, tying new lines, letting the dirt work its way under my nails. One afternoon, I took my old fishing rod from the shed and repaired the cracked cork handle. My hands remembered the motions easily, winding the thread, smoothing it tight, sealing it with varnish. I hadn't fished in years, but I set it against the wall near the front door, just in case the mood ever took me. Days passed in this quiet rhythm. I read more, the kind of thick novels I'd always set aside for when I had time. I fixed the sagging gate at the side of the house, sharpened the kitchen knives until they glided through a tomato without effort. Every so often, I'd hear from my son, a short call, usually in the evenings. "How are you, Dad? Everything okay?" I'd tell him yes, everything was fine. He never mentioned Ethan, and I didn't ask. There was a certain peace in the withdrawal, like stepping back from a painting so you can see the whole picture instead of just the strokes. I began to notice the ways I'd been bending myself to fit into their lives, adjusting my schedule, keeping my questions light so as not to seem nosy, offering help before it was asked for. Without those habits, my days felt steadier. One evening, while going through the small cupboard where I keep important papers, I found my will. I hadn't looked at it in years. I sat at the table with it spread before me, the kitchen light casting a warm circle on the wood. My pen hovered over certain lines, my mind already considering changes, not out of revenge, but with the thought of directing my help where it might matter most. The idea didn't take root all at once. It came in pieces. A newspaper article left on the bus stop bench, mentioning a local boy who'd been bullied but had just won a scholarship. A snippet of conversation overheard at the post office about a student working nights to help his family cover bills. I started asking quiet questions at the market, at church, at the library. Not prying, just listening. All the while, I kept my routine calm and predictable. Mornings in the garden, afternoons in the workshop, evenings with a book or a chess puzzle. I saw fewer people, but the ones I did see, I saw fully, conversations without rush, without my mind halfway on whether Ethan would call. The silence no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like space. On the first truly warm day of summer, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, the wood warm under my bare forearms. I watched the street as the shadows shortened, and for the first time in months, I realized I didn't feel the pull of waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for the sound of footsteps up the walk. Whatever bridge had stood between us was already too weathered to cross. And rather than trying to rebuild it plank by plank, I was beginning to see there might be another path entirely. That thought stayed with me long after the tea was gone, and the evening settled in. The days that followed were quieter still, but they no longer felt empty. The quiet was becoming mine. The idea came together the way a plant grows, quietly, without fanfare, until one day you look and see it's there, rooted and real. It began with a name. Liam. I'd first heard it at the library. Mrs. Carter, the head librarian, was chatting with another woman about the upcoming high school graduation. "It's a shame," she said, her voice lowered. "That Liam boy is bright as they come, but they're barely scraping by. His mom works nights, and he's been working weekends just to keep the lights on. And to think, after all he's been through with those boys at school." The other woman made a sympathetic noise. "Wasn't he the one?" Mrs. Carter nodded. "Ethan's year. Got bullied something awful. Quiet boy. Never fought back." The words landed in me like stones dropped into deep water. I didn't know Liam, but I knew the pattern. Ethan had never spoken about him, but I remembered overhearing snippets in the past, the teasing nicknames, the laughter that didn't reach his eyes when I'd asked about school. I'd assumed it was harmless. I shouldn't have. That evening, I found myself at my desk with a notepad, writing his name at the top of a fresh page. Beneath it, I began jotting what little I knew, his mother's name, where they lived, the fact that he worked weekends at the grocery store. The details were sparse, but enough to start. Over the next week, I made a point of visiting that store. I saw him there, tall but slightly hunched, scanning items with quick efficiency. His eyes didn't linger on customers, but when he greeted them, it was polite, steady. I asked Mrs. Carter, in an offhand way, whether Liam had plans after graduation. She sighed. "Wants to study engineering, but scholarships only go so far. The rest," she trailed off. The plan settled in me then, not as a whim, but as something inevitable. I had money set aside for family, for help I'd always assumed would go to Ethan. But family is more than blood. Sometimes, it's the people who could use a hand and would never think to demand it. I called my lawyer, Mr. Yates, the next day. We'd known each other for decades, and he didn't press for details when I explained I wanted to create a private tuition fund for a student. "Anonymous?" he asked. "Yes." I didn't hesitate. We went over numbers in his office, the air smelling faintly of leather and old paper. The blinds were half drawn, the light thin and angled. He typed notes with the patience of a man who'd seen more families fall apart over money than come together because of it. Within a week, the paperwork was complete. The funds were set aside, locked in. When the time came, Liam would find his tuition covered, no fanfare, no explanation. I didn't tell a soul. Ethan came by once in those weeks, asking casually if I'd reconsidered paying for the trip. I told him I hadn't. He shrugged, masking his disappointment with practiced indifference. If he wondered what I was doing with my money instead, he didn't ask. The secrecy wasn't about pettiness, it was about preserving the purity of the act. This wasn't a lesson I wanted to gloat over. It was a seed I wanted to plant, knowing the fruit might grow where I'd never see it. In the evenings, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea, the garden darkening in front of me. I'd think of Liam opening an acceptance letter, of his mother sitting at the kitchen table with a bill marked, "Paid." I'd think of a young man stepping into a future without the weight of what had been done to him in school. The thought gave me more peace than anything I'd felt in years. If Ethan ever learned of it, I knew he wouldn't understand, not at first. But maybe, in time, he would. Maybe he'd see that usefulness isn't measured in what you hand over when asked, but in what you choose to give when no one's looking. Until then, I'd keep my counsel. Some things are better left unspoken, at least until the right moment finds them. If you could give to someone in need, knowing it would teach your own family a hard lesson, would you do it? The transfer went through on a Tuesday morning in late July. There was nothing dramatic about it, no signatures in marble halls, no ceremonial handshake. Just a few keystrokes from Mr. Yates' office, and the numbers shifted quietly from one column to another. On paper, it was an ordinary transaction. In reality, it changed the course of one young man's life. 2 days later, I happened to be in the grocery store when Liam's mother came in. I knew her only by sight: narrow shoulders, hair pulled back tight, eyes that carried both fatigue and determination. She was on the phone, her voice trembling in that half-laugh, half-cry way people get when they're trying to sound steady. Yes, all of it. They said it's paid. Tuition, books, fees, everything. She paused to listen, then gave a short, almost disbelieving laugh. I don't know who, no, they wouldn't say. Just some anonymous fund. I kept my head down over the basket in my hands, studying the row of canned tomatoes as though I had all the time in the world to decide between brands. When she passed me in the aisle, I caught the faint scent of laundry powder and summer air clinging to her clothes. There was a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. That night, I sat in my workshop, hands resting on the smooth curve of the stool I'd been carving. The radio hummed softly in the background, a voice reading the weather report. Outside, the last of the daylight stretched thin across the fence. I thought of Liam opening his acceptance letter, perhaps sitting in a kitchen chair not unlike mine, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. I thought of the relief that would spread through his home like sunlight breaking through cloud. I didn't need to see it to know. Ethan heard about it before the week was out. Not from me, of course, but from the swirl of chatter that moves through a high school faster than rumor. He came by one afternoon, leaning against the porch railing. You hear about that Liam kid? He asked, as though it were casual conversation. I did, I said. Some loser gets his college paid for. Just like that. Guess it pays to have a sob story. I sipped my tea and didn't answer. Crazy, though, he went on. Nobody even knows who did it. I mean, why him? I met his eyes then, just long enough for him to look away. He left a few minutes later, muttering something about meeting friends. There was no satisfaction in hearing him belittle Liam. Not exactly. But there was something else, the knowledge that my gesture had landed in his world without him realizing its source. The strike had been made, but the mark was invisible to him. In the days that followed, I went about my routine as though nothing had changed. Morning coffee by the kitchen window. Afternoons in the garden. The occasional trip to town for supplies. But inside, there was a current running, steady, deep, unspoken. I'd done what I'd set out to do. And I'd done it in a way that no one could undo, question, or demand back. Late one evening, I found myself outside under the stars, the air warm with the scent of cut grass. I thought about the boy in the grocery store uniform, now with a future opening before him, and about my grandson, who still believed generosity was something to be asked for and received on command. The contrast was sharp, but I let it be. Some truths arrive slowly, in their own time. And some people, I'd learned, can only hear them when the echo is far enough away to be recognized. I didn't know if Ethan would ever connect the dots. But I did know this: the lesson had been set in motion. Whether he learned from it was his choice. It was nearly a month before Ethan came to me with the truth burning in his pocket. I was on the porch that afternoon, sanding the arm of the old rocking chair. The wood was dry and pale from years in the sun, and the sandpaper rasped softly with each stroke. I heard the gate click, then his footsteps on the path, slower than usual. "Grandpa," he said, standing just outside the reach of the shade. "We need to talk." I set the sandpaper down and brushed the dust from my hands. "All right." He stayed standing, arms crossed. "I know it was you." I didn't pretend not to understand. "What do you know?" "You paid for Liam's college. Mom said you must have, who else could?" It's just, why him? Why not me? The question hung there, heavier than the summer heat. I leaned back in the chair, letting the silence stretch. Do you remember, I said slowly, a few months ago, calling me useless to your friends? His eyes flickered, just for a second. I was joking. Were you? I kept my tone even. He shifted his weight, looking down at the porch boards. Okay, maybe I shouldn't have said it. But that's not the point. It is the point, I interrupted, not sharply, but with enough weight to still his words. It's the point because it told me how you see me. And it told me what you think you're owed. He didn't answer, but I saw the stiffness in his jaw. I picked up the sandpaper again, running it lightly along the curve of the chair. Ethan, usefulness isn't measured in how much money you can get from someone. It's in the lives you choose to touch, and how you touch them. Liam needed help. He's worked for everything he has, and still life has been harder on him than it's ever been on you. His voice rose, frustration breaking through. So I'm just, what? Not worth helping? I met his eyes then. You're worth helping when you respect the hands that help you. The words settled between us. He didn't flinch, but he didn't speak either. A bee drifted lazily past the porch, the hum of its wings the only sound for a moment. I set the sandpaper aside again, folding my hands in my lap. You asked why him. The truth is, Ethan, sometimes we give where it matters most, even if it's not where we're expected to. You've been given more than you realize. Not just by me, by your parents, your teachers, this whole community. And still, you looked at me and saw only what I could hand over next. His mouth opened as if to reply, but nothing came. I'm not angry with you, I said. But I won't fund the kind of thinking that sees generosity as a bottomless well. Wells run dry when they're not respected. The screen door creaked in the breeze, the smell of the garden drifting up, tomato leaves, warm earth. Ethan finally said, so that's it? You're just, done? No, I said. I'm here. But I'll give when it matters, not when it's simply wanted. For a long moment, he stood there, the weight of the conversation pressing down. Then he turned, walking back down the path without another word. I watched him go, the gate clicking shut behind him. I didn't know if he understood yet, or if he'd carry this as just another grievance. But I knew I'd spoken plainly, and that was enough. The rocking chair creaked as I leaned back into it. The wood felt smoother now under my hands, as if ready for many more years of quiet use. Would you have explained your reasons, or let silence speak for you, the days after our conversation passed without incident? No slammed doors, no pointed silences over the phone, just space. I didn't try to fill it. The house settled back into its old rhythm, the clock in the hall marking the hours, the kettle hissing in the mornings, the slow creak of the porch boards under my steps. I spent more time in the garden, pruning the roses, tying up the bean vines. The earth gave me something my family hadn't in a long time, a return on care. One afternoon, a letter arrived. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. Dear Sir, it began, I don't know who you are, but I was told an anonymous donor paid my tuition. I wanted to thank you. I've worked hard for years, and this means more than I can explain. I'll do my best to make it count. It was signed simply, Liam. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter in my hands for a long while. Outside, a warm wind moved through the maple leaves, their shadows dancing faintly on the wall. I didn't need him to know it was me. The gratitude in those few sentences was enough. That evening, I walked down to the shed and opened the old cedar chest. Inside were boxes of photographs, most of them curled with age. I found one of Ethan at 8 years old, holding up the first fish he'd ever caught. His grin was wide, the sunlight glinting off the water behind him. I slipped the photo into the corner of my workshop mirror. Not as a reminder of what was lost, but of what had been real once. Love doesn't vanish just because it's unreturned for a time, it changes shape, sometimes finding new places to live. Ethan came by again a week later. He didn't mention Liam. We spoke about small things, the weather, the garden, a loose shutter I'd been meaning to fix. He stayed for tea, not long, but long enough for me to notice he asked how I'd been. I answered simply, and we let the conversation rest there. I've learned not to expect quick changes in people. Seeds take time. Sometimes they don't sprout at all, but that doesn't make planting them a waste. In the evenings now, I sit on the porch with a book, the air cooling as the sun sinks. The rocking chair moves under me with a smoothness it hasn't had in years. The street is quiet, save for the occasional hum of a car passing. I breathe more easily these days, not because I've solved anything, but because I've stopped trying to solve what isn't mine to fix. Helping Liam didn't close the distance between me and Ethan, but it closed something else, the restless need to prove my worth to people who'd already decided its measure. Worth, I've learned, isn't a thing handed to you by others. It's in the choices you make when no one's watching. The garden is thriving. The tomatoes are heavy, the bean vines tangled with new growth. I planted a young maple last month, just beyond the fence. It will outlive me by decades, maybe more. Someday, someone else will sit under its shade, never knowing who put it there. And that's all right. Because peace isn't in the recognition, it's in the act itself. I keep my peace the way I keep my garden, quietly, with steady hands, knowing the reward isn't in the applause, but in the bloom that comes in its own time.